So, when George H.W. Bush takes over the office of the presidency in 1989, there are some big changes afoot on the international scale. We call 1989 a year of revolution, in part because there was a big push for change in many of these countries that had lived under communism. In China, China had been struggling for a while to adjust to life after Mao Zedong. The founder of Communist China, Mao Zedong, had led a few movements before his death in the 1970s, which had severely damaged China. In particular, the decade-long Cultural Revolution, which took place from the 1960s into the 1970s, had wrecked the educational system because in the name of communist purity, it had purged a lot of people in education. It had completely destroyed the social unity of China, making people very suspicious and paranoid about their neighbors, right, being turned in or their neighbors turning them in for purge, execution, or exile. And so after Mao Zedong's death, Deng Xiaoping comes into office in China in 1981. And he is left to clean up the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. And so Deng's, my apologies, sippy is loud. Deng's changes in China became known as Deng's Revolution. And under Deng, China reintegrated itself into the global economy, which meant embracing some elements of capitalism in a similar way that the Soviet Union we talked about last time was doing with perestroika or restructuring. But also, this was only possible because of the thawed relationship between the United States and China, which had happened in the late 1970s after the groundwork had been laid by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger in the early 70s. So Deng encouraged contact with capitalist foreigners in a way that would never have been acceptable under Mao Zedong, who preferred self-sufficiency and isolation for China. To rebuild Chinese universities, Deng sent Chinese students to study abroad at foreign university so that they could bring subject knowledge and technical knowledge back to rebuild the Chinese education system and economic infrastructure. And he allowed curtailed access, but still access to outsiders, allowing China to remain politically communist, but still economically viable. Now, he had the same difficult balance that Gorbachev did in the Soviet Union with how much change can you embrace before you're no longer communist, or how much change can you embrace and still maintain control. And indeed, one of the weaker links in this idea, this Deng's revolution, was sending students abroad to study because, yes, they're going to gain more subject knowledge, more technical knowledge, but they're also going to get a taste of what it is like to live in a capitalist democratic society and realize that there are certain civil liberties that they don't have under a communist system. And this results in a series of students' protests, most famously at Tiananmen Square in Beijing. His economic reforms did not translate into social reforms in the way that Gorbachev had with the Soviet Union with glasnost or openness. And he violently cracked down on any students agitating for more democracy in China, including sending in tanks and troops to put down student protests at Tiananmen Square, resulting in death. These students had been exposed to ideas of democracy in their studies abroad. They were arguing for at least a little bit more civil liberties and openness, and they were responded to quite brutally. So, in China at least, there will be some changes, but mostly economic changes. China will still maintain a communist totalitarian government. In Eastern Europe, the cracks in the communist governments were starting to show, particularly in Germany. The East German government opened the Berlin Wall, which had been a physical barrier separating East and West Berlin, East Berlin being under communist control, West Berlin being under capitalist democratic control. They had a literal wall erected to keep people from moving between these two spaces. And in 1989, the East German government formally opens it, with protesters taking sledgehammers and any other objects they could to physically tear down the wall by the end of the year. So Germany will become reunited in 1990 for the first time since World War II, as we no longer have this separation between a communist and Soviet controlled Eastern Germany and a capitalist and democratic independent West Germany. So Germany will officially be reunified in one singular Germany as of 1990. In other places in Eastern Europe, the revolution away from communism continued to go fairly smoothly. In Czechoslovakia, they nicknamed the ousting of communism the Velvet Revolution because it was marked by very little violence or resistance by the communists who are being outed. So in some places, we do see a little bit more physical struggle, but for the most part, a lot of these governments in Eastern Europe simply just ceased to exist and acknowledged the rising protests, which had been taking place since the 1970s Helsinki Accords, which had said that these communist states should give their citizens more civil liberties. But the big domino is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we talked last time about how Mikhail Gorbachev, who came into power in 1985, had tried to embrace a limited series of reforms to prop up the wobbly Soviet Union. In particular, reforms to the economy, or perestroika, and then reforms to the idea of freedom of expression, what we call glasnost, or openness. Now, Gorbachev's attempts at reform caused widespread dissent and chaos. It caused economic collapse as production declined and inflation skyrocketed to these attempted economic changes. Glasnost opened the floodgates of criticism and protests that had previously been squashed by the threat of violence. And as Eastern European nations were one by one tearing down communist governments and becoming democratic and capitalist, the peoples of the Soviet Union saw this and looked at this as example. And so what we start to see happening is the republics, which made up the Soviet Union. So the USSR is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Okay, we call it the Soviet Union, so it's made up of different member states. So these member states began to break away from the Soviet Union. In August of 1991, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declared independence. And by the end of 1991, the remaining 12 Soviet republics, including the largest one, Russia, broke away from the Soviet Union as well. Boris Yeltsin, who became the leader of the new Russia, crushed a coup against the new reforms and revolutions while Gorbachev was vacationing in Crimea. And so Russia will be one of the last dominoes to fall in the Soviet Union. So Yeltsin reforms Russia's economy into a capitalist economy and dismantles the Communist Party in the absence of Gorbachev, and the Soviet Union was formally dissolved by the end of 1991, which meant for the first time that the Cold War is done. Okay? It had lasted for 46 years, almost half a century. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, now the United States is faced with a brand new landscape in foreign policy. And the big question is going to be, what do we do about this?